Dietz. Please help me welcome Luc DuBois and Steve Dietz.
Here's a fun thing. Let's see if I can do this handheld. I'm going to turn off some lights for a sec. Let's see if this does anything. Can you guys see that thing up there? All right. So that thing is listening to me. Here, I'll prove it to you. Right? It's listening to my voice. And basically what happened to me, and this is kind of a funny story, is I flunked out of engineering school. And in flunking out of engineering school, I discovered a whole wonderful world of things that are actually kind of related to engineering, but are not the kind of things that you can learn in school. And one of them is that music, which is a chunk of what I'm going to show you, is basically all about making sense out of information. And so I'm going to attempt to prove that to you pretty briefly. When I was in college, I had a band, and I'm going to find the picture. Here we go. I had a band called the Freight Elevator Quartet. We had a cellist and a didgeridoo player. You guys ever heard didgeridoo? Sort of Aboriginal instrument. And a guy with a bunch of drum machines. And I used to perform music on these kind of old synthesizers from the 1970s. And we'd concluded pretty quickly that we were really boring to watch. And so what we decided to do to attempt to integrate video into our performances is we bought ourselves a bunch of little wireless video cameras and embedded them in Nerf footballs, and then gave them to the audience. And the audience would pass them around, and they could do whatever they wanted. And then on the screen, you would see this. And what this is this is actually the sound coming into the computer, being shown basically by video. So like if you've ever seen on your car stereo, you have those lights that jump up and down. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's called a spectrum analyzer. Like late at night, you can see like they're all hopping up and down to the different frequencies. This is a video equivalent of that. So these are the low frequencies. These are the high frequencies, bass to treble. And if something's really loud, it's now. And if it's really quiet, it's 10 seconds ago. And that's all there is to it. So it's a little memory machine, if that makes sense. And in doing that, we suddenly became very popular because people would do things like, you know, you could make out with your girlfriend and then watch yourself make out, right? You could do all sorts of crazy hijinks. But one of the things that it did, which was a lot of fun, is it proved, A, that what was happening on stage was actually happening on stage, because we use a lot of computers, and when you see someone on stage with a computer, you're always slightly suspicious that they might be checking their email. But the other thing that it did was it gave the audience a sort of insight into basically what's really happening with the sound. It's visualizing the sound, and I got really interested in essentially the idea of transcoding information or turning things from sound into image or back into sound or what have you. And so I'll show you a quickie early example of that. Let's see if I can get some sound. There we go. So this is a piece I wrote for guitar. And what's happening is the computer's listening to the guitar player, and different notes cause the computer to draw different directions and different colors and different lengths of line. Does that make sense? Okay. So like maybe a C would be like draw forward and it's green, and an E flat would be like take a right turn, right? What this is technically called is turtle graphics. If you're of a certain age, you might have done this on an Apple II when you were in grade school. And if the guitarist plays it perfectly, you get a plant, okay? If he plays it wrong, you get a different kind of plant. Yeah, that's called a mutation. It's okay. What's interesting about it maybe is that what you hear is these musical riffs that repeat over and over again. Right, that kind of thing. And what that is that's basically the musical equivalent of the graphical primitive of the plant. The simplest shape in the plant is a little line with a branch off the edge of it. That happens like 800 times in this piece in different keys and different registers. And the interesting thing maybe about it is the plant is, plants are fractal. all right, which is in a fancy way of saying that, and Mandelbrot just passed away, so this is sort of a good tribute to him, is that little parts of the plant look like the whole of the plant. Do you guys sort of see that? We got like a thing up here that kind of looks like this, and then this kind of looks like the whole thing, right? And when we listen to music, in fact, when we take a grasp at any kind of information, we tend to break it down like that. We try to break it down into hierarchies. We even use those terms in music. We talk about musical sentences, right, or musical phrases that are made up of notes, and then those phrases connect together to movements. We really like the idea of organizing our information that way. And that got me into a whole kind of crazy world of stuff. And I'll show you some of the stuff. So I thought of trying to do something similar like that for sound, to think about how can you like sort of leverage the power of the computer to do something interesting that tells you something about how sound actually works. And so one of the early pieces I did was a piece called Billboard, which takes every #1 pop song on the Billboard Hot 100 and accelerates it so it lasts for 1 second for every week it was at #1. Okay? So you get the whole history of the American pop chart, right, in 37 minutes. And so all these kind of fun things happen, like all of 1978's in the key of F, right? It's all those Bee Gees songs, right? Andy Gibb can only sing one note, right? But if you grew up listening to pop radio, which I certainly did, you have part of this memorized, whether you like it or not, right? You know, so you're gonna look at this and be like, oh, I hated that song, or I remember that song, or I lost my virginity right there, or whatever. You know, you have like a whole kind of thing of that. And I did a whole show around it. So I started thinking about this as basically a cultural canon, as something that when you get a #1 song, you go into a list, right? We value this list. Here's another list. This is something I did for the Sundance Film Festival in 2007. This is called Academy. And it's every Academy Award Best Picture sped up to 1 minute. So it's 76 movies in 76 minutes, right? So this is From Here to Eternity, right? And the whole movie is in there. I'm not skipping through the movie. They're averages. So every movie is kind of blurred, if that makes sense. And when you get to things like the 2000s, the movies get crazier and crazier, right? This is Gladiator, right? And you start thinking to yourself, wow, this is a lot less legible than the movie before it. And that's because the average length of a movie shot in 1940 was 26 seconds. Now it's 6 seconds, right? We edit our films like music videos. And to round out the piece, I made this, which is every Playboy Playmate of the Month, with her eyes centered. So this is 50 years of Playboy in 50 seconds. And I started thinking about these things. So I started thinking about these things as kind of interesting in terms of what they represent in our culture, because we value these things. These are basically canons of cultural value, but we don't really think about why they're chosen that way. And so we think about, you know, #1 songs and Academy Award Best Pictures and Playboy Playmates. We put them in lists. We put out books of them, but we don't actually think about how we choose these things, right? To get a #1 song, you can't just have a good song. You need a bunch of companies to help you. You know, the people who vote for the Academy Award for Best Picture are the people who are eligible to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, right? It's a peer review. It's not a vote, right? Don't even get me started about Playboy. But you get the sort of idea, right? We did not pick these things, right, in a democratic fashion, which I think is interesting. So moving right along. So you can see I kind of like to speed things up, and I kind of like to look at snapshots of them. While I was doing the piece that's on show in the Ulrich, which I'll talk about in a sec, I was also doing a very extended performance and film project with a woman named Leon Cifuentes, who's a performance artist. And we made a piece called Fashionably Late for the Relationship, which is a different kind of acceleration. We constructed a boudoir, okay, under a tent on a traffic island in New York City. And she spent 3 days out there on 4th of July weekend getting ready for a date in slow motion. And I filmed it. And then I sped it up to 60 speed. So everything she did in the performance that lasted an hour takes a minute in the film. Everything that takes a minute in the performance takes a second in the film. Open to the public, and so it takes her 16 hours to pick out a dress and 4 hours to do her nail polish, right? And while she's doing all of that, it looks like she's moving in some weird kind of extreme type of normal speed, and the entire world is flying by around her. And we thought about this as an interesting metaphor for how men and women view time differently, and how people view what they're doing in private versus what they're doing in public in different senses of time, right? When you're alone in your room getting ready for a night out, that's a different time scale than when you're out on the street trying to hail a taxi. So that was fun. And then while I was doing that, I was making the piece that's on view in the gallery here, and I'll just sort of give you the quickie tour. I was commissioned by the City of Denver and the Democratic National Convention Committee to do a piece for the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver, and it's called Hindsight is Always 2020. And what I did was I made eye charts for every president from George Washington to George W. Bush, where I analyzed their State of the Union addresses and made a sort of list of the 66 words that they use the most that nobody else uses as much. So all the words in these charts are unique, okay? So George Washington, his number one word is gentleman. George Bush is terror, right? Ronald Reagan is deficits, right? You can sort of imagine how these are going. Richard Nixon is truly. Some of these you can probably guess. So for example, Abraham Lincoln is emancipation, right? FDR is democratic, right? Bill Clinton spent most of his presidency talking about the century in which he would no longer be president, right? So you sort of get the idea. My favorite one of the set is Lyndon Johnson's. He began every paragraph of his first State of the Union address with the word tonight, because he was the first president to have to give the speech on primetime television. His real word would have obviously been Vietnam, right? And then what we do is we make a couple things. We make big light boxes out of them. These were shown during the Democratic National Convention in Denver. And then we make letterpress prints out of them. This is the set that's on view at the Ulrich. These are at the Wiseman Museum in Minneapolis. And this was on view during the Republican National Convention, which happened a couple weeks later. And they've been touring around and doing their thing, and I'm very happy to have them here. Let me show you a couple other little things that I've got kicking around, and then Steve and I can hang out and talk. My current obsession is with online dating. Okay? How many of you guys do online dating? Don't be shy. And nobody wants to admit to it. It's like so funny. Okay, I know more of you do online dating than the two people who raise their hands because, and I happen to know this because so this is a census year, right? It's 2010. We're doing a census. So I decided to make my own. And the way I decided to do it was I joined 21 different online dating services. And I downloaded everyone. So I have 16.7 million single Americans on a hard drive. And I sorted them by congressional district. So I can tell you how many people in your district are shy. And how many people are looking for someone who's fun. Right? And then what I can do is I can compare the districts lexically and see which districts would make the best matches for other districts. So I can tell you that all the people in Santa Fe should be dating all the people in Detroit. They're perfect for one another. Okay? So this is a piece called A More Perfect Union. And so I have all their imagery. These are all the dating profiles. Hint for any men in the audience who do online dating. One major faux pas that happens pretty constantly in online dating services is as your photo, don't use a photo of yourself with an attractive woman. That happens a lot. It's really like, that's not what you're supposed to be like putting out there as you're trying to, it's just weird. I think that's really strange. Especially if that attractive woman is your daughter, which happens a lot too. So what I did was I made these maps. Okay, so this is the shy map, all right? So green, the way this works, it's a two-dimensional grid. So green means people don't say they're shy. Red would mean lots of women say they're shy. Blue would mean lots of men say they're shy. So something that's pink is sort of equal men and women saying they're shy, if that makes sense. So you can sort of see in the American South, most people don't self-identify as shy, except for this one little weird spot in Florida. You guys aren't particularly shy. This is the Kansas 4th Congressional District. This is where you are. But the rest of your state, outside of the Kansas City area, is pretty shy, actually. Although you're not as shy as North Dakota. Those guys are really shy. All right. This is where people say they're lonely. If you live in Appalachia, you're apparently quite lonely. Though along the eastern and western coast, you're less so. This is where people say they're sexy. We don't have a very sexy country. But if you zoom in, you will find out that people in the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area are definitely sexy, as are people around the San Francisco Bay, and Los Angeles is very sexy, okay? You get the idea. And here you can see where, where people say they're looking for someone who's funny, which I always thought was a good thing. So yellow are the people who don't really care, or white are the people who don't really care about humor. So you can sort of see. So Nebraska is actually an incredibly humorless state. Right. So that's too bad, maybe. So there you go. So that's sort of the conceit of the piece. Along the way, I've been working on a few other things that, just very briefly, one of the things I do, I'm a composer, so I should have come out straight out and said that. My fine arts practice is really an outgrowth of the things that I find musically interesting, and which I think are sort of compelling to me for the purposes of sound. I just finished a big suite of pieces for a violinist named Todd Reynolds called Moments of Inertia. And Moments of Inertia, because why would you know what this is, are basically the physics equations that you use to figure out how much force it takes to change an object's state. So how much effort does it take to take a wheel and spin it? Okay? Or how much effort does it take to twist something? Or how much effort does it take to stop something from rotating? That's the moment of inertia. Does that make sense? Sort of, kind of? And so I started thinking about it metaphorically, like, what is a moment of inertia of your society, right? So basically, how much effort does it take you to break up with your girlfriend? How much effort does it take you to quit your job? How much effort does it take you to engage with someone who you've just met in a more meaningful way? How do you compute your own moment of inertia? And I made a series of pieces that were for violin and also include some studies in high-speed photography, some high-speed portraiture. So that was kind of fun. I don't know. I think we should probably start talking now. Should we start talking now? Yeah, I'll show you one other thing. My one other thing, assuming I can get this working, is here's my latest and greatest wacky thing to go along with the dating project. Brittany. Okay, so I've been teaching my computer to all these little tricks involving computer vision, which is basically trying to teach your computer how to see. And so, for example, say you download 1,000 paparazzi photos of Britney Spears. And then you teach your computer where her eyes are. Click on her eyes. All right, you can see this is kind of a theme I got going. Once you do that, you can basically feed any video footage of Britney Spears into the computer, and it can find her eyes and lock them in the center of a frame. And so this is a piece I'm doing in a series called Pop Icons. Only they basically are church icons, only they're pop icons. So what you do is you take this little video and you put it in a ridiculously overwrought, psychotically ugly gilded frame. And you put it on a wall, and you make an iconostasis, right? You do this with Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake and Prince and David Bowie and Michael Jackson and Madonna, and you've got your wall of pop icons, right? And it's kind of fun. I've been thinking a lot about how we use computers to analyze our cultural society, but a lot of times what computers do is they do what you tell them to do, not what you want them to do. So this is a good example of a failure that I like a lot. This is a Valentine's piece I made. And what it is the LA Times film critic put out a list of the 50 most famous Hollywood kisses. Okay, last Valentine's Day. And so I was like, a list. I love lists. And so I have obsessive compulsive disorder. You might not have figured that out yet, but maybe you have. And so I downloaded all the films. and tried to teach the computer what lips look like. So it would draw like a line between the lips of the people kissing, and it completely and utterly failed. And this is what it did instead, because it basically found everything in the frame that might be lips, which include, you know, Lauren Bacall's jacket, right? And, you know, the edges of people's hair, right? And whatever, you know, and so you sort of get through the entire thing, and, you know, Grace Kelly's eyes apparently look like lips, right? This is Zeffirelli, Romeo and Juliet. Let's get some 80s movies. This is Pretty in Pink. Right. This is Top Gun, I think. Yep. That's Kelly McGill. That's Tom Cruise. You can tell this is before he had the nose job. This is Moonstruck. That's Cher and Nicolas Cage. Right. This is Ghost. Right. So you get the idea. I thought it was interesting because it actually unveiled something a little bit more profound than the silly thing I was trying to show, which is basically points of interest from the computer's perspective. This is Twilight. In the frame that are, you know, based on a pattern, and it's actually kind of what our eyes are drawn to anyway. So I thought that was kind of a neat little thing. Anyways, why don't we chat?
First of all, thank you, Luke. That was amazing.
Oh, thanks.
So, I mean, obviously went through a ton of material, and I think one of the things that we'd like to do is get to questions from the audience relatively quickly. So we're not going to belabor things. But the reason, I don't know if people had a chance to see that graphic of the formula for computer art. But one of the reasons I wanted to put it up there is that this is actually something that an artist named Jim Campbell put together, which I use all the time as a sort of fairly broad way of thinking about computer art, and it really has just 3 parts to it. But they're important. I think there's something that we lose that Luke is sort of demonstrating in all of his work. And one is that there are all these different inputs. And the input could be a keyboard or it could be a mouse, but in fact it can be anything. It can be data, it can be data sets, it can be weather, it can be computer vision. And then there can be output. So you can transform a picture into a sound output. You can transform a mouse button push into a letter on the screen. Fairly simple. But what happens, you know, in the middle here is that the computer has a memory which is then acted upon by algorithms or programs that the artist is making. And it's there that magic really happens, I think. And, you know, as a curator, I sort of have this dismissive term of, I see a lot of transcoding art. Someone will come up to me, you know, or do a studio review and say, look what I did. I transformed this GIF image into a sound piece. And it's really a transcoding thing. And Luke mentioned this notion of transcoding. And of course, it's a very powerful tool, but I guess the only point I really want to make, and maybe we can sort of expand on that, is that what you do with that transcoding is the difference between good and bad, between interesting and uninteresting, between boring and exciting. And what Luke has managed to do, I think, with so much of his work, is really figure out a fascinating way to take these inputs and create outputs that are either and both personally interesting and culturally interesting. And I guess maybe that's my first point, Luke, is I wonder, does this, I mean, I haven't talked to him about this diagram before. Does this make any sense to you as a practitioner? And can you talk a little bit more about that transformation of, you know, taking a literal set of data and outputting it as a physical, in a sense, set of data, but in between is something's happening, and that's sort of what's happening in between, you know, your earlobes, I guess.
Jim Campbell's brilliant. I really like his work. It's funny. I've never seen this before. I mean, the hard thing about this is like, he's right. Like, this is what happens, right? You have some sort of stuff, and then you have some operation, and then you get this other stuff, and that's cool. The hard part, the interesting thing is like where the human intervention happens, and that's, I guess, in choosing the input and the algorithm to get the output. And my sort of approach to a lot of it is that a lot of the success or failure of computer art or information art or whatever you want to call this stuff is about like the metaphor, the sort of underlying metaphor that you're using to get from A to B. And so, for example, like in the eye charts, the Hindsight piece, originally when I was asked to do that piece, I was going to do something like dopey, like I was going to make a Hot 100 list of like presidential lines, you know, like God bless America, right? George Washington, 1789, you know, number one. That'll be number one, you know, and going down. State of the Union is sound, right? I am not a crook. You get the idea. And then I was in Santa Barbara. I did all that research at UC Santa Barbara in the political science department, and I was hanging out in the hotel room one night, and I was watching CNN. This is 2006, so it was a couple years out. I was watching James Carville when he was still on CNN. You guys know who that is, right? It's the Economy, stupid, that guy. And he was sitting in a chair, not unlike this, right, bald head, you know, and he was talking about he was on a rant about the Bush administration as he does, and he was talking about vision. And he was like, the problem with him is he doesn't have vision, and and I was sort of like thinking there, and I was like, vision, that's right, that's the term you use to evaluate leaders, is how much vision they had. How do you test vision? You make eye charts. So I'm going to make eye charts, right? And so that was just the, you know, and so it's like all you got, so it's all James Carville's fault. I was on a flight with him in to New Orleans once, and I tried to tell him that, and his like security detail kind of got rid of me. But he so he'll never know. But it's about like kind of coming up with that, like, oh, this is how this has to look, or this is what you're going to turn it into, because you can turn anything into anything. That's the cool thing about these computers, is you can you can vision anything you want, but it's about coming up with something that when people see it or they hear it, it kind of explicates something that maybe they knew all along, maybe, about their culture, about the way they see. And that's like the trick. And one of the things I always take issue with is, you know, according to the Wikipedia and according to a lot of, you know, people, is that information art has a start date. You know, it's sort of like there was some show at MoMA in 1970 that whatever. But I always think like information art, you know, we've had it for zillions of years, right? We just call it by a really banal thing. We call it music, right? Because music is information. Music is an unfolding of notes, data, right? And you turn it into something. And instead of a computer, the algorithm is a good performer. In the hands of a good performer, she can take the notes on the page and make magic with it. So that's the sort of underlying schema of what I'm always trying to figure out, I guess.
And I mean, I think, so I don't want to belabor this. I mean, I think we can sort of go away from that now. But I do think that, you know, you have a really remarkable ability to create things that we care about that can easily turn into things that we don't care about in someone else's hands. But
right.
It does, you mentioned music, and you mentioned the idea of information in relationship to music. And, you know, I always think about information in relationship to Claude Shannon, the theory of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mathematical theory of information.
Right.
So that was an interesting thing to hear, but maybe the question I have on that relation to that is, there's sort of, maybe in a sense, three different kinds of metaphorical structures that are expressed here. I'm sure there's many more, but one is the music, which I think has a different relationship to sort of cultural memory and cultural practice than the eye charts, than, let's say, the Academy Award films, which are a little more, I don't know, I guess in some senses they're a little bit more straightforward. I don't know. So maybe the question to you then is, how do you see that difference, especially between the performative algorithms and the ones that end up more as still works or as visual arts pieces?
Right. I think a lot of the thing about music, the thing about composition for me is I do a lot of they call it algorithmic composition instead of calling it computer art, but it's sort of analogous. The idea that you would essentially surrender part of your musical vocabulary to a system and let the system run its course and then map that to sound. So that's like the plant, right? So the way I made that piece was I drew the plant, and then I figured out how I drew the plant and turned that into a score, handed it to a guitar player. The guitar player said, "You really want me to play this?" And I said, "Yes." And then he did. And it's, you know, and he was like, "Okay, I'm going to charge you a lot of money for this, man." But it was like, but it was, that kind of thing. But I, in my musical brain and in my visual art brain and in my software development brain, there's always this thing kind of underpinning them all, which is that it's basically a fight against global dumbing, basically, that we don't pay enough attention to the information that we're being exposed to. In terms of cultural literacy, in terms of cultural critique. So classic example of this is things like the presidential speeches. Like if we paid a little bit more attention to the rhetoric that our political leaders use, we'd have a much greater insight into the underlying sort of zeitgeist of what they're actually thinking about. And it's hard because you got too much information. You're bombarded with it, and that's what things like the Academy Award piece was a little bit about. Was we live in a sort of ADD, obsessive compulsive culture, right? So like iPods, right, are like the most evil thing on the planet, right? If you're a musician. And it has nothing to do with the record industry. It just has to do with listening habits, because basically people are obsessive compulsive with music now. They either are obsessive, they listen to the same song over and over again, or they're compulsive, where they listen to something, can't get to the first chorus, and then hit the next song. Right? Everybody does one of those two things. That is not a normal listening habit. That's enabled by this stupid piece of technology that Steve Jobs invented, right? What used to be, you'd have to listen to the whole record and then you'd flip it over, right? And the technology that enables media delivery, this is sort of a little McLuhan here, but like, has a politics to it, right? So there's something about an iPod that changes the way that you experience music, just as there's something about a compact disc or something about a record or something about that, and we don't think about it enough. So that's always kind of in the back of my head, and a lot of it's like, honestly, a fight about, this happens to you, I'm sure, the term like new media, right, or the term technology in art, or the term computer art, right, kind of can occasionally get you stuck in a ghetto, right? And the thing about it is, or it's a genre, and a genre creates a ghetto, right? So, and the bummer about it, to me anyway, especially as a musician, because musicians are hyper aware of this, is there's no such thing as saying something like music and technology is an incredibly disingenuous statement, because unless you're basically improvising a vocal piece in a forest, you're using technology, right? Notation is technology. Acoustics, if you're in a church, that's technology. If you're playing an instrument, that's technology. Amplification is technology. So you're always using technology. In fact, like 2,000 years from now, the only piece of pre-millennial technology that will still be in relatively constant use will be the Stradivarius violin and the Steinway grand piano. Those will be the only things we've still got kicking around from the 1900s that we think are, so.
And I totally agree with you that there's this sort of conflation of the technology with being a medium. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the more interesting ways that the critical side of the field is moving toward is understanding it as behaviors. So it's not, as you say, it was a Stradivarius or it's a computer, but the behaviors they're exhibiting are composition or playback or different kinds of things. And so this is a little bit of an oblique angle, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because one of the sort of really primary behaviors that people think about in relationship to new media is audience participation.
Right, interactivity.
And interactivity.
Uh-huh.
And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think any of the projects that you showed had any interactivity of someone else, other than, it's this sort of distance, this remove of data. And so I guess, again, the question there is, there's this broad area of interactivity, and why do you hate it so much?
Yeah, exactly. Part of it is the things that I build are instruments, and I think of them as musical instruments, so quite literally, actually, the sort of software algorithms I do. And instruments require training. And they require a certain amount of use to get good at them. So I'm maybe a little bit too much of a control freak to say anybody playing this instrument can get the exact same wealth of experience of someone else doing it. So when I collaborate, I build tons of interactive stuff. Tony Dove, for example, right? I write the software engines for a interactive filmmaker in New York, a woman who essentially edits her films in performance on stage, right? So that I've built this very sophisticated system under her direction so that she can basically shoot a feature film and then on stage basically make all the choices that an editor and a director would make in the editing room as to what you see and how you see it and all that stuff. And that's an incredibly interactive, you know, that's like a really complicated machine, but she rehearses with it like 6 hours a day before the performances. You know, she plays it like a piano. And the pieces that I do with musicians are the same thing. You know, the pieces, a lot of what I write for, like Todd Reynolds, this violinist I work with, I write a lot of software to basically visualize what he's using or do things to his sound or whatever, and he has to practice with them. And the thing that worries me about interactive art isn't that the artistry is bad, it's that basically, in that case, the inputs and the algorithm and the outputs, they tend to, in order to just get that kind of quickie experience with them that's meaningful, they have to be pretty linear, right? There's only so many things you can do. And the thing that makes it a little bit hard for me to kind of get my head around it is, what would I want like a human being to do to show what I kind of want to show anyway? And like what is the exploratory thing of that? The census actually might end up being kind of a website because there's enough stuff in there that I could see people surfing it. Like, you know, I really want to look at Wichita and I really want to see that
The
stuff.
dating?
That thing with the maps and the dating data. I think that might actually turn into something. It'll be works on paper, but it'll also probably be a website, because I think there's like, you know, I've got 20% of the adult population in the United States sitting on a hard drive. I might as well let people surf it, right? You know, before I go to prison for 2 trillion years for identity theft. But yeah, so it's, you know, so that's maybe worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just 2 questions, then we'll move to the audience. But the one comment about that is that Stephen Johnson, the author, sort of suggests that one of the most important and difficult challenges for the 21st century, for Bill Clinton's century, is how do you design platforms, or in your case, instruments, that people can use that, you know, aren't just rubbish and scratch and graffiti, but also don't necessarily, may not necessarily require, or maybe have results that you're not necessarily know in advance. Right. And that's a really difficult thing, and you know, I would love at some point to see you take on that challenge, because I think that, you know, there is such control around your projects that what would it be like to open it up a little bit to more variables that you don't control?
Right.
Just a comment.
Right.
In the new media field, there's this sort of ongoing relationship and somewhat of a debate between, especially with artists who are working in the academy, which you do at Brooklyn Polytechnic, although on the engineering side, or
right.
maybe especially on the engineering side.
I'm
and that's
incognito.
This issue of relationship of research to artwork. And I guess you talk a lot about, or you talked a little bit about, you know, I'm interested in exploring like computer vision. I mean, there are a number of artists right now who are looking at computer vision, both because on the engineering side it's becoming more and more accessible, which makes it, and then you can sort of do other things with your, you know, black box algorithm with it. So I guess my question is, how do you view that relationship and that tension between the research of tools and computer science and your output of art and, you know, cultural meaning?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so just to unpack this a little bit, I have a day job, and my day job, you're gonna think this is a hoot. I'm a professor of electrical engineering at New York University. Just think about that for a minute. And so, which is possibly insane, but you know, I don't know. But one of the things that I do, I mean, you know, it's the one. My gut response to that is in terms of coming up with all those systems and stuff is I'm an autodidact. So never took an art class, never took a film class, never took a computer science class. I studied music. The only thing I'm academically qualified to do is write string quartets. Right, but I do all this other stuff, right? And it was basically around the idea that I wanted to do these things, and I had a computer, and I was like, well, I got this thing, I might as well figure out how to use it. And I became really interested in sort of essentially systems design, coming up with like little algorithms to get me something or do something or whatever. And I think, that's kind of a research, but it's also in a very like honest sense of the word, pure amateurism. In the sense of love, in the sense of doing something you love. So I don't I'm relentlessly paraprofessional in those kind of activities. I don't pretend to be a filmmaker. I don't pretend to be like a sort of capital C composer or a capital P programmer or a capital A artist. I really look at all this stuff as just like things I need to figure out to see something. So, it's like the Hindsight piece. That piece was not made really for there to be a beautiful piece of art at the Democratic National Convention. That piece was made because I was really curious about what would happen if, you wanted to analyze presidential speeches. And the most fun I had in developing that piece was hanging out with the political scientists at Santa Barbara and talking to them about their work and like looking at all this stuff and being like, oh my God, that's crazy, and trying to figure all that out. So that's part of it. So yeah, I teach in an engineering school, I do all that stuff. I have a little bit of a composer's avoidance to the art as research thing simply because the music as research mantra is actually one of the many reasons why nobody goes to the symphony anymore. Basically, the history of post-war music, post-Second World War music is about music essentially retreating into the academy, becoming all about math and becoming all about systems and becoming all about research and completely divorcing itself from the pop cultural mainstream, from anything to do with politics, etc. And that was a completely well-intentioned decision right after the Second World War. All of the European and American avant-garde composers decided that they were going to make a point of writing music that no one would ever go to war for again, right? So you basically cut off Western music at the head and start making atonal music based on algorithms, music based on chance. You have John Cage turning 100 in a year and a half, that kind of thing. And that's all, that was all very well intentioned. The unfortunate side effect of that is you get an American cultural machine in the performing arts, certainly, but to some degree in the fine arts, that puts far more value on delivery than on creation, right? Every city in America has a really good symphony and a really good ballet and a really good repertory theater, but nobody cares about composers and choreographers and playwrights coming out of those cities anymore. So that's a problem. And part of that and that's a very self-inflicted problem. Part of that has to do with the way in which sort of artists in the second half of the 20th century essentially positioned themselves intellectually. And so that always, when people say like, this is my research, I'm like, I don't think this is research, man. This is just you being you. Why don't you just celebrate you being you and say, I'm interested in this? It's research in the same way that looking through a photo album is research. It's research in the same way that, whatever, dating is research in that way, if you think about it, so I don't know, it's kind of tricky.
Right. I think it's tricky, and I think it's, again, there's this question of how you turn that research into something that's meaningful. And so my last question, then we'll open up to the audience, is, I think it is important to always position, at least for me, the new in relationship to a really ongoing historical set of discussions and debates. And one of those is this relationship of beauty and truth, whether it's the Greeks or whether it's Ruskin. And I guess I look at like the eye charts and the maps, and they both have this relationship to facticity. Mm-hmm. And this notion of, you can imagine, what's the CNN map guy sort of up there going in and sort of saying, well, this
John King,
I
hate that
kind
guy.
Of thing.
Yeah.
But so, again, I'm just wondering, how do you think about these metaphors that you're both creating and embodying in relationship to sparking just general thought and some kind of, cultural truth that they're representing?
Right. So the reason I made that thing about John King. So John King is emblematic of what I think is actually a problem, which is that we've started to mistake informational graphics as information. So you have that thing in the 24-hour news cycle where I'm going to show you a map instead of actually telling you the story, right? Tag clouds are a problem like that too. And the thing that makes me worried, that's a global dumbing phenomenon that I can, sort of basically, I have a colleague in the computer science department at Poly who calls that proof by declamation, right? You just sort of like put something on the screen and you're like, it is! And then everybody's supposed to shut up and just take it for granted. And that's a problem. But the beauty thing, I mean, I think there's definitely beauty in information, like Tufte allegedly proved that. There's definitely beauty in coming up with interesting metaphorical transformations. But, the truth of the matter is what happens is, every society uses the maximum level of technology available to it to make art. That's just normal, right? That's sort of a normal impulse. It's not normal like it always happens, but that's a sort of natural impulse. And we always comment on what's around us. And so if what's around us is essentially the informatics of 21st century society, we kind of have no choice but as artists but to try to make sense of that information. And some people have very beautiful explorations of that. People like Golan Levin, right, or Casey Reese, right? They're literally making very beautiful computer artwork that is exploring aesthetic implications of this space. I'm more interested in political implications of this space. Not that, and I don't mean to insinuate that it's not like all good art has to be political. It's the other way around. It's actually all political art has to be good, because otherwise you hurt your cause, right? So it's the other way around. But it's so that's kind of what I'm interested in, just as sort of a slightly socially awkward member of society. I kind of look at it in like through maybe a little bit of a different lens. But I don't know. Yeah, there is that relationship, and the music, the work that I do is it's not untrue in the sense that I don't cheat, right? I had the eye charts independently validated by the nice people at the New York Times data visualization group who ran the same numbers I did, and they said, yeah, that's kind of right. Okay. So I check my facts, but at the same time, and I don't take a partisan stance in that way, because they sort of say what they need to say on their own. And I think that itself is actually kind of beautiful, like the words that we use in the movies, other people's movies, other people's songs, transforming in this way can actually be really haunting, because you're watching your history unfold before your eyes, and that's something my pop, who is a big kind of American history buff, always taught me, was to always like think about cycles of history and when we've been somewhere before and that kind of thing.
Great. I'm sure there are questions in the audience, and so.
Yeah. A lot of times, I choose things based on sort of historical event coming up or something that I want to work toward. So the eye charts are easy, right? There was an election coming up and I wanted to do something on presidential speeches. The Britney Spears thing came up because I was thinking about for some reason, it was basically a conversation over beers. I was thinking about the demise of MTV, in the sense that MTV no longer actually does what it says it does, right? There's no music and there's no television, right? So the Holy Roman Empire of, broadcast networks, it just shows soap opera essentially. But I was raised on music videos, right? And very much so, I was sort of glued to the set watching them. And I had a huge record collection. And so I thought about, once they're eclipsed and once they go, the music industry goes into the ether. And we look at the 20th century as basically this weird little anomaly, right? Cultural anomaly where, for this 75-year period, people made billions of dollars off objects that had sound on them. Right, because this is actually weird if you think about it, and that'll go away. Like, who are the saints of that religion? Who are they? And so I started thinking about pop icons. And Bono would be like maybe one of them. Bono's a historical singularity, right? He's the only pop star who will ever be a billionaire off of his own record sales. That is now impossible, right? No one will be like him ever again, right? They have to open a clothing line or start a perfume or start their own record label, right? He's kind of an interesting person in that way. So he's a saint, right? Maybe he's Jesus. I'm not sure. Sometimes he certainly thinks he is, but but there's like a sort of thing to that. So I don't know. I was sort of thinking about it that way. But the kisses, it was Valentine's Day, and I wanted to make a cool video for my girlfriend. That was basically what it was. So it's like that kind of thing. I did a 4th of July piece where I filmed the American flag for 24 hours and set it to Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, stretched out to an hour. Right, and it's this kind of meditation on what a flag kind of just looks like suspended in air. It moves very slowly. So sometimes I'm just looking at the calendar and thinking about it.
Fashionably Late was not, I don't think, related to a specific event. I mean, it's more generalized kind of event, whereas the Academy Awards and the compositions with Todd. I mean, those all. So what was there something different about that?
Well, the thing with Fashionably Late was Leon and I. That was very much a collaboration, and so basically Leon had made, the performance artist in that piece, had made a bunch of reaction performances to what she saw as essentially critical flaws in other pieces of mine. So she made this really interesting piece about my Playboy thing. There was a sort of performance response to it, and we'd been sort of talking about like, well, I want to do one to you, for you. I want you to do a performance, and for me to do something that I see in it. And originally that piece was much simpler. It was basically going to be like a white box kind of Abramovich-y kind of endurance performance, and I was going to film it. But then we started thinking about it, and it was like, well, if I'm going to like film you really slowly moving in a gallery, how the heck are we going to know time's flying by? It's just going to look weird. And we were like, oh, no, okay, why don't we do it outside? And then we were like, why don't we do it outside for 3 days in a heat wave in New York on 4th of July weekend? And we'll open it to the public, so like thousands of people. So that thing turned into this whole like epic mess, like way beyond, because we were on the front page of the New York Times, right? This messed up thing happened where we sent the New York Times a listing to try to get a theater listing. Just like in the little, like, at 8 p.m. tonight. And they called for clarification. And they were like, I don't understand. When does it start every day? So it's like a 3-day run. When does it start? Like, is it at 7? How long is it? And I was like, no, dude. It's the whole time. And they were like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm like, it's 72 hours. And they were like, we want an exclusive. Right? So they sent like a reporter and a camera and like all this stuff. And so it was on the cover of the Monday morning paper. And so at the end of the piece, which was Monday at midnight, we had like 2,000 people crammed on the traffic island. I had like half a squadron of police officers like dealing with the whole thing. The thing was like a nightmare. And me, like I'd never directed a film before. And my director of photography, Toshi Izawa, who also does Marina Zerkow's films, basically told me, he's like, look, just like wear a backwards baseball cap, don't shave, never answer your own phone, and instead of eating at the craft services table, just eat hot dogs and bad Chinese food, and everybody will think you're a pro. Which is exactly what happened. I did exactly what he said, and after the shoot, everybody's like, really great to work with you, man. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no clue. So that was, but that was like, that was a piece. It wasn't about a calendar event. That was a piece about, what would, how do you do a reaction to a woman doing a very stylized performance about gender maintenance and about how, and we started thinking about like, well, how do we relate as a couple, as partners, and what can I make out of it to do that? And so the music is kind of a little symphonic and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I didn't realize that there was that reaction
Yeah,
that
yeah.
she'd done. Are there other questions?
I do. I dream a lot actually when I sleep, which is almost never. But I do actually have pretty. I actually do think about dreams a lot. And one of my dear friends in New York, who's an artist named Michael Joaquin Gray, who's a really interesting person, has been keeping a dream diary, for years and years and years, and sort of talks to me. We talk about them sometimes, and. You're absolutely right in the sense that basically our sleep time is what helps us essentially make sense of a lot of the things that are going on in our lives. and so, yeah, so one way to maybe look at it is some of these pieces are kind of, would be something maybe I'd dream or something I want to show you from my dreams. But it's also that it's a type of information. It's not that we're bombarded with information, like just being the human race is about being bombarded with information. Our entire perceptual apparatus is highly tuned to basically filter out anything we don't need to survive, right? So our vision basically lets us see things happening up to about 25 times a second, right? Our hearing starts at about 20 times a second, so if something's moving slower than 20 times a second, we see it. If it's faster than 20 times a second, we hear it, right? Our senses overlap in that way to basically so that nothing can come in a gap and kill us, right? It's very smart. We're built very well, actually. And so like we have this whole kind of apparatus for that. And so it's all about filtering data. The hard part is that the data, the information that we're bombarded with these days, it's given to us in this very kind of neutral, factual space that doesn't really explicate the emotional impact or what we're supposed to do with it, because that's hard. It's like the information that you in your dreams is the information of society and the information of your experience. But when you're given data over the TV or the internet that's someone else's experience, it's much harder to empathize with it. I did a piece called Hard Data a couple years ago. There was basically a string quartet in 6 movements where all the notes were based on essentially the casualty stream of the U.S. war in Iraq. So it was all the men and women and children, civilians who died, the soldiers who died, the people who had gone missing, and the people who had become refugees, right? And it was all based on the Iraqi national anthem, which is called Maltani, which is a Palestinian folk song from the 20s. It's sort of orchestrated for string quartet. And it was about that information because you ever hear of this band Fugazi? You know what this is? It's a hardcore band from the 80s from Washington, D.C. They have this amazing song called Instrument. And the singer, Ian MacKaye, the guy, the lyricist, says, we need an instrument to find out how loss can weigh. Like, what is the weight of loss? All right, and so I decided to do this piece because it's hard data that we've been bombarded with. The Iraq War is one of the first experiences in American history where we have more information than knowledge. I'm not speaking about Wichita, I'm speaking about as a country as a whole. The majority of us do not participate actively in that war. We know the facts and figures, but we're not fighting it. All right? So we're given information about it daily on the television, but comparatively very few of us have experience, right? I have 5 friends in the service, one of whom is a casualty, right? But the rest of them came home, thank God, safe, right? But the majority of us are not, in serving in the same way that we've been doing in other military conflicts. So we have data, but we don't have knowledge. And so I thought, this is hard data, but it's also hard in that other way. It's not hard data like facts, it's hard data like it's unbearable data. It's something that you should feel absolutely crushed by, but because it's delivered in this kind of sterile way on the television night after night, we don't think about it in the same way. It just kind of happens, and that's not good. That's not good for you to basically essentially like have the informatics of human tragedy or human conflict projected at you with John King showing you maps, right? That's not the right way to experience that, right? That's why war photography is so powerful. It's a different way of showing it. What else? What else we got? Anybody? Sir? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I use Max almost entirely. I work for Cycling 74. I work for the company that makes it. And I was one of the developers of the video component of it called Jitter. And I'm their product manager, which basically means I write a lot of memos nobody reads. And part of that is so the couple little things I showed you guys at the beginning where I can shout and it makes those little shapes, or the camera thing. Those are all little software things that I wrote, and I wrote them in a programming language called Max MSP, which has been around for about 20 years now as a way to program a computer without thinking you're programming a computer. Basically, you drag around a lot of boxes and you hook them up and it does stuff. It's more like learning a foreign language than a programming language. It's data flow. You're just making charts and graphs and telling the computer what to do. So that's sort of my weapon of choice. In an emergency, I can actually program a whole bunch of, I write stuff in C++, Casey Reese, who's an artist who makes really beautiful work with the computer, uses a programming language called processing. That's really interesting that I use a little bit. So I use all sorts of stuff.
One of the things that I often talk about is this, what I call the powers of 10 issue. And one of the main examples of that is that for some people, programming is if you do it in assembler. And some it's, if you do it in C++.
Yep.
Some it's, there's an interface like Max MSP or even higher level interfaces. And I guess my follow-up question to that is, in terms of practitioners, do you have a sort of philosophy about how close practitioners should be to being able to program, or is it incidental, or are there multiple models, or just how do you think about that when you
I think there's
talk to people?
I think there's a million ways to do it. The advantage of knowing how to program a computer yourself means that you simply don't have to hire anyone, or you're not at the mercy of basically out-of-box software. So if for example, if you're a video artist and part of your arts practice is really about designing a really amazing look for what you're doing, and all you got to work with is After Effects, what that means is you're essentially at mercy of the engineers of After Effects. And you can come up with infinite combinations of effects and create a real artistry about it. But if you ever want to do something that they don't think is worth putting in the software, you're kind of in trouble. So it's that kind of thing. And part of that is also just knowing what it is you're doing. So so it's less about having the chops to program. It is actually understanding what's going around on the hood. Like, if you're a digital filmmaker, and it helps to understand things about codecs, right? If you're a sound designer, if you're doing things with digital sound, and you don't actually understand how signal flow works in a digital audio workstation, everything's going to be distorted and fuzzy, or it's going to be recorded too quiet, right? And so there's a sort of battery of understanding of those tools that you need to acquire just to get the right production value. And then going beyond that, there's this sort of creative arsenal of tricks and techniques that you can sort of learn, some of which are very close to computer programming. You're essentially, like, if you're a mastering engineer and what you're doing is you're trying to make a record, like 12 songs that were recorded by some guys in a shack somewhere, and they think it's genius, and you're like, man, you screwed up like all of it, and you have to make it sound good for the record label. That's a real kind of scientific inquiry. That's a lot of work. And so you have to, you're almost basically re-sculpting their sound, and so it helps to understand that stuff. But I think, 100 years from now, everybody's going to program computers. They're just maybe not going to know that's what they're doing. It'll just be sort of normal. So, yeah.
More questions?
There's a line from a Talking Head song. David Byrne says, "Facts are useless in emergencies," and I agree with him. But part of it is I don't think that culture maybe can be really presented in a really objective fashion, right? So my facts are like, what did I choose to look at? And the fact that I chose to look at something is, in a way, that's a choice. That could be a political choice, right? So one of the flaws, so I'll give you some of the holes in the Hindsight piece, right? So I took the State of the Union addresses, right? So the thing about the State of the Union addresses is if you died in your first year in office, you didn't give one, right? So poor William Henry Harrison, is out of the loop on that one. He doesn't have an eye chart, right? If you're a one-term president, you say a lot less words, right? So you get less cool words in your eye chart. So George Bush Sr., you know, the arsenal of words he has to choose from, the guy only gave 3 State of the Unions, right? FDR gave 15, so he gets the best words. He gets, because they're unique based on who said them more. So he gets Democratic. The only reason he gets Democratic, it's not that he was talking so much about Democratic. Everybody uses that word. It's just he was a 4-term president, so he said it so many times that he beat out everybody else, right? That's sort of natural, right? So there are some there are some flaws in the system, and I knew about my best friend's a professor of statistics, actually, so she was sort of like, that's kind of wrong, and I was like, yeah, I know, but maybe that's interesting. Until FDR, they weren't given as speeches, they were handed in on paper. They were like homework assignments. The ones from the 19th century are incredibly boring. They have the entire executive branch budget in there, right? They're talking about railroad subsidies, and they're talking about, it's all the kind of banal stuff that you would never have in a State of Union now. State of the Union now is political theater. You give a shout out to a bunch of people in the balcony. You talk about your sort of like, you give props to Congress, big up, you do your thing. And, and everything's about scoring political points essentially for the party that you happen to represent. And so they're different now than they were once. And that's reflected in the pieces, the types of words. Once you get into the 20th century, we get much more hard-hitting words, right? People start saying things like idea, which is George W. Bush, right? Sorry, George Bush Sr. And you start seeing things like truly, or I asked William Safire, who was one of Nixon's speechwriters, why that word, truly, and I was like, did you know that when all's tallied up, Richard Nixon's most common word is truly? And he's like, absolutely. He's like, you think he's like, you liberals think we're stupid. We're not stupid. Like, of course we know that. And I was like, oh, okay. So I was like, it's an interesting kind of thing. So that's like the facts, right? The facts are not the facts. And so it's a tricky thing to kind of figure out. Yeah, we'll let you guys go.
Luke, thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Thank you, man. Thanks for hanging out with me.